Now we move on to macroeconomics, and one of the first things that I need to say beforehand is that, which I already actually said regarding to microeconomics, is that even this is even more so applicable to macroeconomics, is that think of yourself as building a model. You need to have the basics right, and the model, the various models within macroeconomics are very interlinked, and the crescendo is that you end up with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But this model is built up of various basic elements, and this has happened over time since the 1930s, when Keynes started talking about how government could intervene to stimulate an economy from the aggregate demand side. So you can think of this as really the model in macroeconomics, that macroeconomics in textbooks at university basic levels is trying to build, by starting off at foundations, and then you end up with this big model that you can use to analyze what is happening at aggregate levels in macroeconomics. Unlike microeconomics, macroeconomics really look at national values. For instance, the national level of unemployment, the GDP. So it's not looking at individual markets as we have been doing in microeconomics. But what I want to caution against is that in macroeconomics we don't add up, for instance, demand curves of various markets and come up with the demand curve which is at a national level, aggregated at a national level. In microeconomics, we learned that we can take individual demand curves or household demand curves, add them up and come up with a market demand curve. The same is not true for macroeconomics or for the aggregate demand or the aggregate supply functions. And you'll see when I explain to you how we conceptualize the relationship that forms the relationships between the two variables that forms the aggregate demand curve, for instance, the price level and output. It's not really the same as adding up all the market demand curves and coming up with the national aggregate demand curve. But we'll get back to that later on. For now, I just want to show you the structure of this model, sort of the big structure of the model, and say to you, macroeconomics is divided really into two broad areas: aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand on its own, has got various models that lead up to aggregate demand. And really that's an area of many of the economists who advocate intervention of government, especially when your economy is struggling, is at a low, undergoing a recession. Then most of the time many economists would advocate for aggregate demand intervention type policies. But once your economy has been kicked off, you want to move away from aggregate demand policies and start adopting aggregate supply policies, or you can do them concurrently. There's also no reason why you can't intervene in the economy from both sides. So what is it that constitutes aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand is divided up into goods and services market. As we discuss the goods markets in microeconomics, as well as money markets. So in the goods and services market, the price is the price, the price of various goods and services. Whilst in money markets, the interest rate interest rate is the price. The same way that we talk about the price of labor as the wage, here the price of money is the interest rate. So money markets versus goods market. And from goods and services market, the policies that stem out of that particular component of the aggregate demand model are fiscal policies. So for instance, government spending, the tax rate, all those form part of fiscal policy. You'll see later on that we also talk about the consumption function, private investment, and we see how that leads to stimulating aggregate expenditure so that we can stimulate national output. On the monetary side, we talk about monetary policy. In various countries, it is the responsibility of the central bank through interest rates that determines what kinds of policies are being adopted in your money markets. But there's also a link. You'll see that there is a link between these two sides of the aggregate demand model. And that link really is through the level of interest rates. And the level of interest rates is very related to the level of private investment. So whilst interest rate is important for money markets, private investment is important for aggregate demand. So this would be government, this would be private investment, and we also talk about consumption. So what we're going to do next is look at the goods market, develop a model for the goods and services market, which will then include fiscal policy and will also include private investment as well as household consumption. Once we're done doing that, then we talk about money markets, and we talk about the interest rates, and we talk about the relationship between interest rates and investment. So really you'll see that this investment variable in the goods and services market through the interest rate connects these two markets. And then we're going to put the two together, and then we come up with the aggregate demand model. This model was first developed by Keynes in the 1930s. It was really a simple Keynesian model at the time, and then it became bigger and bigger and bigger. But later on, then the aggregate supply model was developed. I must say that the aggregate supply model, in its development, various components that build it, is not as intricate really as the aggregate demand model. You will see that the majority of the discussion in your textbook on aggregate demand side of the model is a lot more elaborate than the discussion here. And you can think of the aggregate supply side of the economy as those ideas that were promoted really in the 1970s, 1980s by Reagan, by Thatcher on supply side economics. Supply will generate its own demand. So making sure that the environment is conducive for investors to supply various output in the market. So pushing out supply, making sure that the labor regulation is conducive for private investors, making sure that you've got a skilled labor market, making sure that technology and innovation are developed in your country, making sure that you've developed your infrastructure so that you can attract, for instance, FDI, as well as local private investment to push output by pushing aggregate supply. So initially we'll start off by looking at aggregate demand, and that later on we're going to put together aggregate demand and aggregate supply and have this holistic model that that we will later on be discussing in terms of how you can use various types of policies and when can you use various types of policies, when are those policies going to be more effective than other times, and so on. So I just wanted to give you this big framework first and foremost, and then we get into the more technical work, especially around developing the aggregate demand side of our model.